here. Hi, everybody. Normally, we'd be in LA at this time. We're still here, and thank you for the warm weather. We feel quite welcome. I'm happy about that. Claire and I are going to try and do a little bit of a tag team act here, and we're not quite sure who's going to say what. I may suddenly turn to Claire and say, why don't you talk about that? So just be prepared for that. But before we start focusing in on the issues surrounding the antiquities at the Getty and acquisition policies, I just wanted to sort of lay a little bit of groundwork for you about what is the Getty, because the Getty is actually an extremely complicated organization. It's not just the museum. The museum is the most public face of the Getty, but there are actually two other programs, the Getty Conservation Institute, which does scientific research in materials and develops techniques for preserving not only objects but sites around the world. So they have a very large global footprint from China to Africa, everywhere. They do earthen architecture, for example, and almost every culture in the world has some form of earthen architecture to preserve. There's the Getty Research Institute, which had its nascency as a library, an art history library that supported the museum, but quickly grew into a much larger study center with a photography, a photo archive collection, and also now a very well-known scholars program in which scholars are invited every year to come and be in residence, all working around a central theme. They all feed off of each other over the course of the year. We're very lucky because we get to interact with all of those scholars. The theme this year is the display of art, so anything goes, really. And then there's the Getty Foundation, which used to be called the Getty Grant Program, but then they renamed it recently to the Getty Foundation, which is a grant-giving body. And all of us, the other programs that I just mentioned and the museum, are under the umbrella of the Getty Trust. So in actuality, all of the money that everyone knows about and all of our operating budgets and everything else comes from the trust to the different programs. So unlike most other museums, which have their own board of trustees, which have their own budgets, which take care of themselves as independent bodies, the museum is actually part of a larger institution. And a lot of things that other museums do internally, we don't do because they're taken care of by the trust. So we have some significant operational differences. And I also wanted you to be aware of what the museum collects, because I know Alex's class has done a lot of talking about the Universal Museum and has probably looked at models like the Met, like Boston, like the British Museum, like the Louvre, which really collect world cultures. The collections at the Getty sprang from those areas in which Mr. Getty, John Paul Getty, collected himself, and they were Old Master paintings, Greek and Roman antiquities, and French decorative arts, particularly French furniture. And being not so much decorative arts as just the furniture itself. So those were the three core collections of the museum, and from them sprang three other departments. We now have manuscripts, medieval manuscripts, drawings, and photographs. And all of our collections, with the exception of the Department of Photography, collects in Western Europe. It's only in the photographs that they have really expanded the chronological boundaries of the collection past 1900 up to the present, and are now actually collecting actively in contemporary photography from Asia, particularly China and Korea. But everything else is really focused in Western Europe, and then in the antiquities collection around the ancient Mediterranean. Come on in, don't be shy.
Can I just,
Sure.
just
Please, interject.
also give you a bigger panorama, because when you read about the Getty, you most often read about the museum and activities at the museum because that is the public face, but the other programs that Karol described have very specific missions and very broad missions. So in fact, it does open up a whole panorama of subjects that the Getty is actively involved in. For conservation, it's scientific research on materials and environments, but it is also cultural heritage preservation in the largest sense, and their reach is not focused, as the museums must be, focused on specific areas, but it's global. So in fact, they've been involved in research and conservation and preservation theory and practice on a global scale. So they have interests in heritage preservation that are very specific to that field. Similarly, the Research Institute is interested in the history of art, the history of thinking about art in the biggest sense. So that also expands beyond the traditional parameters that the museum has followed since its inception under Mr. Getty. So in terms of the intellectual history of the discipline, in terms of the practical and scientific, you have a very broad panoply of philosophies, of perspectives, and of responsibilities. And all of these have to link together, or should ideally link together in this very complicated organization, which makes the subject that we are here to talk with you about even more tricky internally, which I think is interesting. You read about certain activities on one level, the public level, but there's also, it has been always traditionally a great deal of thinking about these issues from all of these different perspectives and trying to bring them together. So it makes it extremely interesting for us and informs our perspectives in important ways.
Absolutely. And as Claire said, we try to work together. Sometimes we have very happy confluences of projects. We try and talk to each other early so that if we come up with an idea, we can bring in the other programs in an organic manner rather than a year later saying, oh, by the way, we're doing this. Do you have anything to contribute? So the dynamics are interesting, but they work well when they work together. So I was talking about the collections, and as Claire was just talking about the research library, it made me realize that although the research library began its focus supporting the collections of the museum, it does have significant holdings in areas beyond Western Europe.
Yes, that's another, that's where the possibility to create a collection, that is, this is not just a library of books and serials that you're used to, but the idea was to create an original research collection of original prints, drawings, manuscripts, artists' letters, architects' sketches, this raw material for the history of art, architecture, and the history of archaeology, which is what I did for many years, so that people could look again and do original research on the foundations of how we look at art, how we look at culture, visual culture, and heritage as well. So that meant that you had to go well beyond classical Mediterranean, you had to go well beyond Western Europe, and so other areas of strength in Latin America, in the early photography in Asia, in colonialism. We were able to select thematic issues and then build collections of all of these kinds of paper, rare books, all of this kind of early material. And that also is something that you need to keep in mind, is also under many different ways of thinking, that is also cultural property, that is also intellectual property in its own right. So one has to be cognizant of how one approaches that when you're building a collection and bringing it to Los Angeles. So it's not just the artifacts and the vases and the statues as well. But you can feel free to ask any question at any time, but we can come back to that subject.
So where Claire and I are stationed, if you will, is at the Getty Villa, which is a piece of property on the coastline in Malibu, incredibly beautiful. We are extremely thankful every day when we go to work, I can assure you. And when Mr. Getty purchased this property, I think it was in the 1930s, it had been part of a Spanish land grant, it had been a cattle ranch. When he purchased it, there were actually citrus and avocado orchards on it. And even though now it's in the western half of Los Angeles, at the time, it was a very nice home on the beach outside of the city of Los Angeles, and sort of a country estate, if you will. And at the time, of course, one of Mr. Getty's biggest rivals was William Randolph Hearst. So one of the things that he was interested in doing, in addition to purchasing works of art, was having rare and exotic animals. So we have a bear pit. The bear died many, many years ago, thank goodness. He had a lion. He had I think he had wolves. He had all kinds of strange animals on the property in an attempt to sort of vie with William Randolph Hearst. And this house that we call the Ranch House, for want of a better term, but it actually was the site of the first Getty Museum, because he began collecting. How old was he? Do you remember? I need to know my Mr. Getty.
Yeah,
facts
he
better.
began in 39.
In 39. Thank you. And in fact, we're just opening next week, in fact, a new exhibition on Mr. Getty as a collector of antiquities. This is the 70th anniversary of his first acquisition of an ancient object, which later turned out not to be ancient, but live and learn. So anyway, so he was collecting in these three areas, mostly for his own enjoyment, but he was persuaded to make his collection available to the public. And so parts of this ranch house were converted into gallery spaces. It was very much a house museum, but it didn't take up the entire house, only part of the house. And when the collection really outgrew that space, he decided to build a real purpose-built museum to house his collection. And that is how the Getty Villa was born, because instead of choosing modern or contemporary or any other more frequently chosen styles of architecture, he opted to recreate an ancient Roman villa, which was almost completely unheard of. I don't think it had been done since the early 1900s, when the Wright brothers built a house on the south coast of France called the Villa Karol, which is meant to be a Greek house. In any case, he chose to duplicate the Villa dei Papiri, a Roman villa buried by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD, which was really only known from the tunnels that had been dug through the volcanic debris when the early excavators, if you can call them that, were looking for works of art to bring back up to the surface. So there was some comprehension of what the ground plan of this building was, and a Swiss engineer who was in charge of these excavations, named Karol drew a ground plan, and this became the ground plan of the Getty Villa. There were some modifications to it because it wasn't going to work as a museum completely, but the end result was this completely unexpected building on the coast of Malibu that takes you right back to ancient Rome. And the impetus for making this choice of architecture was the antiquities collection and wanting to display them, or that portion of his collection, within an architecture that he thought was more suitable for them. I guess he didn't care as much for the rest of the collections to house them in a Roman villa, but they were all on the second floor. Everything but antiquities was on the second floor in a very sealed and windowless environment, so you really didn't have a sense you were in a Roman villa until you went back downstairs and were surrounded by this fabulous architecture. And so the museum opened to critical scorn and public acclaim, and became a much loved spot in the Los Angeles landscape, like the cloisters, one of these sort of hidden cultural gems that one might encounter when coming to Los Angeles. And when the Getty trustees decided that we needed more space, as we desperately did, as the holdings were expanding, our galleries were bursting at the seams, and the decision was made to build the Getty Center in Brentwood, they simultaneously made the decision to keep the Greek, Roman, and Etruscan art at the site of the original museum in this architecture that was so suited to its display. And so it was at that point in time, really in the mid-1980s, the second half of the 1980s, that the mission for the Getty Villa was developed. Many years thinking, trying to determine what the Getty could provide that was lacking in the field, what we could offer that you wouldn't find anywhere else. Just having a museum of antiquities is one thing, but it needed to be more than that. And so as it was built and the programs were developed and we reopened in January 2006, we are a museum. That is really the heart of the site and of the mission for the villa, but we also have a branch of the Scholars Program in residence, so scholars come and work at the villa. We have our research library there. Portions of the holdings were moved back to the villa to be housed in the ranch house. And we have a conservation training program. The Getty Conservation Institute, in partnership with UCLA, has created a 3-year master's program in ethnographic and archaeological training. I can never remember the title. I'm sorry, it's long and complicated, but it's to train conservators to, of course, clean, repair, study works of art. And ethnographic, because often conservation training programs don't get to focus in organic materials. And so in partnership with UCLA, the students are able to access works from the Fowler Museum at UCLA. They can bring them out to the villa where their labs are and study organic material that one doesn't find in our collection from the ancient Roman world. I hear a question coming from Alex.
May I interject just
Yes.
for a second? It's just very interesting. We had 2 weeks ago in my class, we had the director of the Barnes Foundation come, and that's another collection that is, of course, indebted to the goals and interests of a private individual who's decided to set up this foundation and set up a museum for looking at art in a particular way, and housed it in a house that he had in fact built for the purpose of doing this, or had arranged it in such a way, and the art placed within it, also in the outskirts of Philadelphia, a little bit of a trek to get there, so removed and all that. And many of the things we were talking about, the special quality, or if there is such a thing of moving out, going far away to this sort of strange-ish locale, and what's being involved now in the breaking of the trust to allow for the move to the Benjamin Franklin Parkway in downtown Philadelphia. And obviously the clear restrictions that Barnes had placed on his collection, on his foundation, about what kinds of choices could be made, and in fact, it coming to a head so that it needed to be broken in some respects to actually have the new building built, etc. So it's very interesting. I mean, just to hear the contrast about another individual who had set up a trust, who had set up a foundation, but clearly there's a great deal of flexibility handed over to those who have control over the material, and so there isn't that very restrictive quality that's in the Barnes. It's interesting to see the contrast.
It was very, I guess, a rather open-ended legacy, and that with the sudden windfall of funds that turned a very handsome bequest into a stellar amount of money, the trustees and directors of those early years realized that you cannot simply use this trust to buy art. That a traditional museum is not, doesn't quite fit the bill. So they tried to think much more broadly in the field of what was truly necessary, and came up with, the conservation program was of critical importance, and they came up with other important ones having to do with digitization and automation of knowledge and research databases, as well as a library. So they did diversify to really try to make an impact on research in this field and on conservation. And that's how it became this multilateral organization.
Exactly. Okay, so before we start moving into the next phase, any questions about what the Getty is? I would encourage you to visit the website, which is not the best website in the world, but each program has its overview statement, and you can get a sense of all of the diverse projects and programs that each of the programs undertakes. It's pretty amazing. It's an amazing place to work. Claire mentioned all that money not just to go towards the purchase of works of art, but it is true that the Getty Museum has quite an endowment and a substantial acquisitions budget, which, when the trust was fully established and the will was settled and the money did finally come through, was rather unprecedented, and put the Getty in both an advantageous but also disadvantageous situation, because as a curator, I know that there's the regular price and then there's the Getty price. And working with private dealers versus purchasing at auction is always kind of a bit of a challenge. You wonder how many zeros you should be knocking off the end of a price tag to reach what perhaps some other museum might pay for a work of art versus what the Getty can afford to pay for a work of art. So the role of a collections curator at the Getty has some sort of unique qualities to it. Of course, we want to purchase the best works of art for the collection, and for much of the 1980s and into the 1990s, there was a very clear mandate to buy the best quality works that you can find to enhance the collection. Now, some parts of the collection that were created by Mr. Getty were extremely fine. The French furniture is second only to collections in France, you know, the Louvre basically, and the Queen of England, who also loves French furniture. And so that is an area in which very choice selections have to be made. The other collections, however, the paintings in particular, were more mediocre, shall we say, in that Mr. Getty was a little tight with his money when he was buying paintings, and he wasn't necessarily paying what the curators would be years later to get paintings of stellar quality for the collections. And so this is one area of the collection on which the largest amounts of money have been paid over the years to really try and bring it up to a completely different level of quality than it was when Mr. Getty died. Now, the antiquities were of very high quality, but they very much reflected the taste of the collector. He loved sculpture, he loved portraits. There were complete areas of ancient art, what we call ancient art today, that he never moved into. He didn't like vases at all. He didn't like anything having to do with death, so no sarcophagi or funerary stelae, anything like that. He was interested in pieces that came from old collections that had a good pedigree. He was very cognizant of the patrimony laws of various nations and was anxious not to break them. So if he could buy a piece from the Lansdowne collection, for example, all the better. You know, in addition to not being tainted by possibly being stolen, it also had this great English history behind it too. So when he made the decision to build the museum, the Villa Museum, we suddenly had a huge amount of space to fill up with somewhat small collections. And so it was really at that stage that many of the collections expanded rapidly, including antiquities. And then, as I said, when the money came in, there was a clear mandate to buy only the highest quality antiquities that one could buy. So I'm sort of setting the stage for what was to come. Like almost every museum, the Getty Museum has always had an acquisitions policy. And one of the opportunities that I had when I became the senior curator was to start going back through all of the successive acquisition policies that had been formulated by the museum. And I was very interested to see that, you know, in the late 70s and the early 80s, when it came to antiquities, UNESCO 1970 was the criteria. But it obviously wasn't being applied. And I can't answer the question why. I wasn't there at the time. But there was a recognition on the part of some of the trustees that this was an important element to be considered in purchasing antiquities. And I think...
And for those of you, I'm just going to interject, of course, because we do have the other class.
Oh, that's right.
The UNESCO 1970 convention is the convention concerning the means of prohibiting the illicit the means of prohibiting and preventing the illicit import, export, and transfer of ownership of cultural properties. And it was adopted in 1970 basically to combat what was seen as the growing problem of looting and illicit and smuggling of antiquities, and it was really the looting issue that was, the provisions that it had in particular were that objects that were taken from a known monument or a known inventory, another foreign country's museum, that was basically taken without an export law or proper permission, was considered stolen, which was in a sense redundant. It sort of would have been considered stolen in existing international law anyway, but it sort of underscored that point. And then the second main provision of it, or that especially was operationalized in U.S. law, the U.S. signed UNESCO in 1972, was provision that said we encourage that signatory nations to the UNESCO Convention develop ways of cooperating through their own domestic legislation and internationally, ways of cooperating to combat the looting or the destruction of sites and materials that were in particular danger. And so this was, it sort of encouraged states to get together to work cooperatively to combat looting.
Yeah, and just another point on UNESCO. I think it's one thing it's important to remember, given the situation today, is that it was really developed to protect Mesoamerica, South America, pre-Columbian culture that was being removed and brought to the United States. And with this initial emergency in mind, it then spread to other cultural artifacts, cultural property around the world. So, the Mediterranean wasn't necessarily at the top of the agenda when UNESCO 1970 was written. But it was there in one of our early policies I was interested to see. Policies are meant to change. They're not set in stone. These are not the Ten Commandments. They're not inscribed in blood or anything like that. They're meant to be flexible working documents that can adjust and change depending on the circumstances of the time. So, as Alex mentioned at the beginning of this talk, our most recent policy, which I hope some of you read, is available on our website if anybody's interested in looking at it, was adopted in October 2006, of course in direct response to the situation that we found ourselves in with the Italian state and the Ministry of Culture in Rome. And between 2006 and the first acquisitions policy, there have probably been about 10 different acquisition policies within the museum. And most of the changes to the policy have had to do with the acquisition of antiquities. And part of this was dictated by the trustees, part of this was dictated by the museum director. Sometimes it was influenced by the curator of antiquities in response to increasing criticism from external sources, and in trying to respond responsibly to this criticism and to see in what ways we could face the challenge of increasing the collection, continuing to add to the collection, but to do so in a more responsible manner. Do you have anything to add about policies at this point?
Just that the UNESCO Convention lists a whole series of categories. They identify the kinds of objects which would be considered cultural property, and it's really extremely broad. And so while antiquities, archaeological artifacts, also ethnographic materials of that may pertain to living communities, indigenous peoples, and living descendants of tribal communities. There's a whole other series of objects that can potentially fall under that, so that acquisitions across the board look very closely at these parameters in deciding about an acquisition. And so in our case, it can, the need to do really close looking and investigation into the background of an object, a very diligent kind of search, would apply to many of the categories, I guess all of the categories that are in the museum, and as I said before, as well as in the library, because original manuscripts and artist drawings, that kind of material, does fall under. So one has to look at a whole multiple levels of international, national legislation of other countries, as well as the particular agreements that our country has entered into with individual countries who have come to us and said, we need your assistance, we have this issue, and we would like to have a treaty, an agreement, a sort of memorandum of understanding with you. And then it's very specifically codified what kinds of objects fall into that. But our administration, and particularly our legal department, takes very broad view. They have to look at all of these kinds of levels and all of these documents. Sometimes they're not always meshing together very neatly, but they have to keep them all in mind. So it's very, very critical scrutiny and complicated.
We'll get to the legal perspective.
Yeah.
That was an education for me. I think I know more about working with lawyers than I certainly did a few years ago. So policies, as I said, are meant to be flexible, and one of our earlier policies that I wanted to bring up in the context of this class was one that was very controversial when it was adopted by the trustees. And the former curator of antiquities, Marion True, was for years, years with many, many S's after them, trying to find ways of working with what we call the various source countries for antiquity. So Italy, Greece, Turkey, any of the countries that ring the Mediterranean, that were part of the Roman Empire, that have cultural remains that pertain to our collecting areas, to try and find ways to work together to bring that material to our museum and to other museums in lieu of purchasing them on the market. And in certain sectors of those countries, among the archaeological sector, for example, and among the academic sector, there was broad acceptance of these types of approaches as a means to, trying to kill the market or limit the market in some ways. But in the political levels, it was extremely difficult to try and make any progress. And so one of the ways that she tried to do this was to work with the museum administration and with the Board of Trustees to revise the acquisition policy so that when an antiquity was proposed for purchase, that we undertake a certain number of due diligence steps, some of which we were already doing anyway. So companies like the Art Loss Registry, for example, had just been formed. They were there to perform a service to museums and other collectors to determine if a work of art had been stolen. They were a listserv, if you will. So they were consulted to see if there was any evidence of an object being stolen in that as a resource. And then another step was to actually send documentation to the source countries, to the ministries of culture in all of those countries, to see if they had any information about an object being illegally removed from their country. And in attempting to do these steps before purchase, of course, we were trying to eliminate the possibility of inadvertently buying something that had been illegally removed. The interesting thing is that on one side of the coin, this was a very open policy and I think a very enlightened policy to try and undertake. On the other side of the coin, it received quite a lot of criticism from the archaeological community, in fact, and from the ministries themselves, that how can you possibly ask us if we have any information about an object being stolen? Your letter to us is the first indication that this object might have been stolen. So how do you want us to respond? No, we don't know. We don't know if this is stolen or not. So it was a very flawed policy, despite its intent to try and move the dialogue forward and to try and be much more open about what it was we were trying to purchase for the museum. And this policy was in place for about 4 or 5 years before it started to get refined and trimmed down, and UNESCO, in fact, became much more of a prevailing attitude to take towards the purchase of antiquities. But it was not until October 2006, with the adoption of the latest policy, that we really came back to what was pretty much our original policy for the acquisition of antiquities, to very strictly apply the 1970 date as our criterion date, so that if we are considering purchasing an antiquity, a work of ancient art that fits within our collecting parameters, it has to have been documented that it was outside of its country of origin prior to 1970. Now, something could have emerged on the market in 1969 and it fits that criteria. But UNESCO serves as this sort of line in the sand for us all to provide some sort of guidelines for purchasing. Now, obviously, I don't try and buy things that appeared on the market in 1969. They go back to 1830, it's quite good. We try and find things that have terrific provenances and were clearly out of their country of origin even before national patrimony laws might have been passed in 1930 or 1939 or whatever. So it's still an evolving practice, and our policy was most recently, I think the most restrictive to be put in place among American art museums in 2006, and shortly thereafter, the AAMD, the Association of American Museum Directors, modified their guidelines for the purchase of antiquities to embrace UNESCO, and part of that was the strong work of the museum directors who were holding their posts at the time, including our director, Michael Brand. But in addition, they added a clause to it that sort of left the window open for a museum to go ahead and purchase a work about which they just weren't sure. They couldn't find the documentation they needed to be sure. They thought it probably was safe, that there weren't going to be any problems with it, but they just didn't have all of that paperwork in a row. And so there is a website that is linked to the AAMD website, in which museums can post information about pieces that they have purchased that don't quite meet the 1970 deadline, and it allows any source countries who are interested to go there, see what's been purchased, and see if they have any information about an object being removed illegally. We cannot follow AAMD. The Getty cannot follow AAMD. Our policy is more restrictive than AAMD, so we will never buy anything that can't very firmly meet the 1970 UNESCO date. Yes, ma'am?
How much is there still available, in the antiquity market? Because that's what I always hear is the big problem, that if you want to buy antiquities with great provenance, then there's nothing to buy because everything is already in museums. So.
Well, that's a very good question. There's actually a lot. And the interesting thing now, one of the points that I was going to bring up later, is sort of the burden of proof. Because before this whole last 5 or 6 years of the intensive effort on the part of the Ministry of Culture in Italy to regain objects from American museums, it was very much, the onus was on the curator and on the museum to discover the provenance of an object, because whoever was selling you that object, whether it was the auction house or the dealer or the owner, they could just provide you with something. Well, I know I've had it in my family since 1920, and that's all they would tell you. And the onus was on the curatorial staff then to try and find out as much as they possibly could about an object. Well, interestingly, that tide has completely turned in the opposite direction now, and the onus is very much on the auction houses, on the dealers, on the previous owners, the private collectors, to provide that documentation, because they know that there is no way that they will have as many possible purchasers as they would like to have if they don't provide that. So I would encourage you to go to the websites of Sotheby's and Christie's. They have just posted the material for the December sales. On December 9th and 10th, they'll be having the antiquities auctions in New York. You can go if you're interested. They're actually kind of boring, but you can go. And they now post the provenance for every piece, whether it's good or whether it's bad, because there are still many people, private collectors primarily, out there who will still buy an object. It's really the museums that have the policies that are looking for the earlier material.
There has been a kind of counterintuitive effect of this, increased scrutiny and increased emphasis on the documenting provenance, and that is that the objects that do have a good provenance, ones that can be traced back through a succession of historical owners, and it can be shown to have existed, well before 1970. Generally, if they're good, they tend to get a better price. And when things are actually worth something, which frankly, antiquities were barely worth anything before in the big picture of the art market, when they are worth something and when that has a value, the provenance, the prices are high, and it brings more things onto the market. It's actually worth the while some sellers to actually consider selling it. Before that, really, if you looked at contemporary art or some other fields,
Modern art, yeah.
antiquities were virtually free. So that was not a great situation. So you do actually see some really interesting material from the 18th century collections in Italy emerging from places where you just wouldn't have expected them to be. And so that's an interesting kind of reversal.
Did you have a question? question?
Yeah, I actually had a quick question, because I noticed that on your collections policy, there was this clause about, in terms of, that you sort of answered it, because there was a clause about needing to find and establish all this documentation except in the cases of a public auction, and I thought, well, what does that mean? What's that about? How strange. And I didn't realize this shift because in that sense you're saying the burden is on, presumably the public, if it's on a public auction, all of that has already been sort of done and presented, and so the burden is on the auction house, in fact, to
Right.
provide that information.
And in fact, that doesn't apply to antiquities. It applies to the rest of the collections, but
interesting.
not to antiquities.
Okay,
We
interesting.
cannot bid at auction for anything that doesn't meet
Right.
the 1970 criteria.
okay.
And this has been a very steep learning curve, especially on the part of the auction houses, who have never had to necessarily provide so much information about a work of art that they're offering up for sale. But I would encourage you to go look at the website and look at the provenances that are listed for the pieces and see what you think of them. Yes?
I just have a quick question. I was looking at, what's been returned and repatriated to Italy and whatnot, and all of the dealings with that. And it seems like you all are really transparent about documenting, to the public what's been returned and what you're still, communicating with them, and you're going to keep this for this long and that kind of thing. Have you all been acclaimed for doing that on your website?
We have been acclaimed for changing our policy first, but in actuality, posting information about what's being returned, Boston did that before we did. And we thought it was a great model to follow. We felt it was necessary to put that information out there so that the public could see what had been returned. And we knew it would also be the first request we would get from the press. So, a lot of the transparency is frankly press management as much as it is being transparent about what we're doing, because, we don't have a lot to hide except for the details of our agreement, which I won't share with you.
But is there also an aspect of fact that even though it is a private museum, it still is public in the sense that it receives tax considerations in the
Yes.
state of California? It is a public institution, so one can't simply divest oneself of these assets merrily and without any sort of thought. It's very much a public function. It has to be handled in a very clear way, even by private museums. I'm sure that
Oh,
there's
yes, absolutely. I mean, the laws of the state of California are very clear about the responsibility of the trustees in divesting, or they were, in our trustees divesting the museum of its holdings in this manner. There were very clear legal rules that had to be followed about how this was done. And it certainly wasn't a case of an Italian carabinieri showing up at the door and saying, I want these 20 objects, and we're saying, here you go. There was an extremely long evidentiary process in determining whether, in fact, the Italian claims could be substantiated and meeting legal burdens of proof. And one of the greatest challenges, I think, for me and for our lawyers was that the Italian legal system and the US legal system are miles apart when it comes to evidence. And it took a lot of angst and anger and frustration to know that, well, even though this wouldn't stand up in a US court of law, it obviously will in an Italian court of law. So let's try and come to some solution with all of this.
Did you have a question?
Yeah.
With regard to documentation, you talked at length about that. Does the 1970 document list any specific legal requirements for redocumentation of an artifact? For example, documents get destroyed, they get lost over time, they get, if there's, God forbid, a fire or another natural disaster. Does the Convention of 1970 provide for specific procedures governing redocumentation of an item where documents get lost or destroyed?
Not to my knowledge.
Yeah.
It's tough.
That's certainly not in the UNESCO convention itself, but in terms of how, again, that issue of reconstructing
Yeah,
documents.
reconstructing provenance is an extremely tricky business, and
Especially because there are instances that
Mm-hmm.
it's not reconstruction rather than construction of provenance, and you have to be able to
forgery.
differentiate. Yes, and you have to be able to distinguish and somehow figure out which is which. Yeah.
yeah, no,
Do you
exactly.
believe that would be a logical next step? Now
Well,
that
I think if it's possible, sure, but in
Find
most
those
cases,
procedures.
it's impossible. I mean, I'll give you an example. Claire was talking about the impact that good provenance has on the value of a work of art. Well, a couple of years ago, when the Albright Knox Museum made a decision to deaccession significant works from its collection in order to create an acquisition budget to purchase more modern art for their museum, there were some really interesting pieces that came up for auction, including the Artemis that made a new world record for a work of ancient sculpture. I think it sold for $28 million at auction. And when you looked at the provenance trail for that particular statue, you reached a point where the records were lost. I mean, they were, said to be found in Rome in the 18th century. Okay, fine, that's entirely plausible. And then in the hands of this private Italian person who was also a dealer, at some point around World War II, the piece was transferred from Italy to London, and the shipping company who handled that, their office was bombed. And all of those records are gone. There's no way to retrieve those. There's no other documentation to go to point to that physical transfer of the object out of Italy and into London. But presumably it happened before 1939. That was the claim. And that's a critical year because that's one of Italy's national patrimony protection laws. Before 1939 is sort of a critical line in the sand for Italy. And this piece seemed to be meeting that, but there's no hard and fast evidence to produce it, nor is there any way to recreate it. But then the paper trail picked up because it left London and came to the United States, and those shipping documents were preserved. And there were actually newspaper articles written about the piece when it came, so there's all kinds of secondary documentation that was preserved before it was eventually purchased by the Albright Knox Museum, where it remained for the next, from the 1950s until just a few years ago. So you have to qualify the evidence, you have to determine what is plausible, what is implausible, you have to accept the fact that there are gaps in the paper trail, and then you have to get your legal department to approve it.
Yeah, it's interesting, your collections policy, because I think about some of those, in that particular case, you'd think that once articles are written about something, and once it's on display somewhere, then that in most states, not New York, but in most states, that allows for the statute of limitations clock to kick in and begin.
Right, exactly.
And so if it's publicly known where it is, if a claim isn't made for its return, then after a certain amount of time, it's free and clear, and therefore it's, the museum can therefore hold it and sell it and legally and retain it, and it wouldn't be subject to repatriation. But and it's very interesting that even in spite of what seems, in that case, it seems once you've met that criteria legally, there's no necessarily, I think, reason or no legal teeth for charging for a claim to be made for repatriation, and yet, because I was looking at the acquisitions policy. Not only do you have this sort of, if I read it correctly, not only do you have a sort of UNESCO 1970 date for having a clear provenance up to from 1970 on, but then there is this additional, it says that there has to be an evidence that it was taken out in a legal fashion, which in fact is an unnecessary requirement for the statute of limitations requirement. So in a sense, you have a double, so that not only has it have to be out, have a clear history since 1970, but in fact, even prior to 1970, if it's been taken out, it needs to be shown that it was sort of taken out in sort of some legal situation.
There have been cases in which an object was researched and it was discovered that it was taken from an institution or from an excavation storeroom or from a museum, even if it was years before 1970. that is stolen
Theft.
material.
Yeah,
You
that
know,
is
figure it out, is it in anyone's
Possession of stolen
interest to sort
material,
of
yeah.
stand on the letter of the law when you really wish to have relations and ongoing relations and collaborative, you know, a future with these countries, so that other objects well before 1970 were returned, even from the early years of the century.
Yeah, absolutely. And at the, just to finish, at the Getty, we returned objects to source countries well before our most recent situations with Italy and Greece. When evidence was presented to us that an object had been illegally removed, and we could verify that, our first step was to notify that ministry, hey, we just found this out. Obviously, we would like to return it. Let's set the ball in motion and get this taken care of, so, yes.
I just want to make sure that I'm understanding this correctly. If the museum has an object that was, that's out of its country before 1970, that you know was in its country before 1970, you don't necessarily have to prove that it was legally taken here, but if it can be proven that it was illegal, then you have to give it back.
Well, our policy states, and I don't know if you had a chance to look at it, in clause 4B, documentation or substantial evidence that the item was out of its country of origin before November 17th, 1970, and that it has been or will be, that's interesting, legally imported into the United States, or, then it goes on to the next case. So, yeah, we are, yes, what you say is sort of true. I mean, ideally, we add pieces to the collection where you can clearly prove that it was out of its country of origin through legal means before 1970, which is what makes pieces collected in the 19th century sort of ideal these days, because they left Italy well before the national patrimony laws. They were part of collections that were formed by aristocratic collectors, who then had them legally exported out of their country of origin. But if some piece of evidence does show up that it was indeed illegally exported, then you can be regarded as the possessor of stolen property, and it's incumbent upon you to return that stolen property.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, a moment ago you said, and as we sort of, I guess, move towards perhaps
Cultural agreement.
cultural agreements, yes, exactly, sort of move toward the future, like what you're being done now and moving towards the future. You know, you just alluded to this fact that it's not always best to stand on the letter of the law.
No,
It is
it is
you know,
not.
it's sometimes, you know, you have to be forward-looking and think about, you know, extra legal solutions. Sometimes it's better to think big picture, think long-term in terms of developing relationships, and I think that's sort of a new, or, you know, a newer trend. And you know, as you were saying, the Getty was actually doing some of this quite a long time ago, but in fact, but to see where that sort of broader shift in terms of antiquities in particular in the museum world in the U.S. is heading, I think that's an interesting thing. We'll perhaps hear more about your particular, what you're doing now, and sort of spoke to the future. Do you have a comment?
I was at the website reading through some of the press releases on the dealings with Italy and the country, but I didn't read close enough to be clear. Were all of these situations dealt with privately between the Getty and the ministry in Italy, or were there public cases that were tried, or did you all work it out amongst yourselves?
Public and, well, yes and no. The decision to return the material and negotiations and the agreement that resulted from the return of the material were conducted privately. However, those objects are part of a criminal trial in Italy that is public, and if you will. But there was no public hearing in the United States about any of this, thankfully.
But the fact that in very recent years there had been two particularly important cases that were prosecuted here for an American collector who had an object, and it was seized by the customs, the so-called Steinhardt Fiale at Gold Bowl, as well as the prosecution of an antiquities dealer here in New York regarding Egyptian antiquities. Those two cases resulted in decisions that pretty instantly changed the policies and the approach of museums, because it showed that, you know, you could be held responsible and you
Which
could be
case, in addition to
prosecuted.
the Steinhardt case, I'm sorry, which was the
Stein-
other?
and
Schultz.
Schultz.
Yeah.
So those
Okay.
were really precedents, extremely important precedents that the US government would recognize cultural patrimony laws of other countries, and therefore it changed the entire playing field.
Yeah, and prosecuted as theft, as a
As-
crime that you could then go to prison for. It wasn't just you were open to seizure.
Under the NSPA,
NSPA, yeah.
the National
National
Stolen
Stolen
Property.
Property, yeah.
So that's a whole different ballgame.
Okay. Yeah. Yes.
We talk a lot about instances of buying things from auction houses or dealers. Is there any possibility of purchasing objects directly from source countries and their cultural ministries, or are long-term loans kind of your best hope right now?
To my knowledge, the only source country around the Mediterranean that has a illicit market is Israel. Nobody else does. And of course, there's a lot of discussion about the possibility of illicit market, the efficacy of illicit market, the pros, the cons, and there are both to undertaking such a thing. It's for me in a position, a curatorial position at the Getty. I don't have a vested interest in an illicit market, because I sort of have a feeling, and this is sort of intuition, I should say, that if Italy, for example, decided to create a illicit market, that the material that they would make available on the illicit market would not necessarily be of interest to me as a curator looking to purchase a work of art for the Getty Museum. You know, that remains to be proven, of course, because no market exists. But I think to even reach that stage, there are tremendous hurdles to be overcome within the source countries themselves in dealing with their cultural patrimony and determining whether or not it should become a commodity in that way. So yes, Israel has an illicit market. There are antiquities that are approved for sale outside the country. I saw an interesting program a few months ago about this spate of very sort of intensive forgeries as a result that were coming out of private collections and things, and were considered to be significant artifacts, but were all proven to be fakes. And they were attributing the illicit market to part of this problem, this interest in purchasing material from the Holy Land, things like that. So, should we talk about our cultural agreement for a few minutes? Because the end result of all of these protracted negotiations between American museums and the ministry in Italy in particular is a series of agreements of cultural cooperation between these specific museums and the ministry in Rome. And interestingly, for those of you who have looked at it, the memorandum of understanding between the Republic of Italy and the United States contains a lot of the same language about reciprocity and what American museums can stand to gain by such a partnership. So I have seen the Metropolitan's agreement, as I think Alex's class has as well, and I know it's in our agreement, and there's a lot of broad language about, you know, loans of works of art, both long-term and short-term for exhibitions, exchanges of professional courtesies and personnel traveling back and forth, participation in excavations, the opportunity to treat and conserve not only recently excavated material, but also works of art in other collections. So there are a number of different options laid out on the table, and it's really up to each museum, or it has been up to each museum, to determine what best suits the needs of their museum and insert that language into these agreements for cultural collaboration. And the Getty's is very broad in that respect. One of the reasons it is actually a direct result of seeing the Metropolitan's agreement, where for those of you who have read that document, you saw that the Metropolitan requested specific works of art come on loan to their museum. They thought this was the best solution for them to try and bring to America works of art that are considered Italian cultural patrimony to share with their visitors. When I saw the Met document, I thought that for the Getty, a different approach should be taken, and that I wanted to be able to travel with Claire and my other colleagues in the department to various Italian institutions and work with our colleagues there to identify objects and projects and exhibitions in collaboration rather than making specific requests. And so the Getty has actually two agreements for cultural collaboration now. There's a very broad general one that was signed with the ministry in Rome. And then in a very enlightened manner, I think the person responsible for archaeology, the general director for archaeology, this very nice long Italian title, Stefano De Caro, has paired American museums with specific museums in Italy in order to form very close partnerships between those institutions to create projects. And so ours was the Archaeological Museum in Florence, and with them we have a very specific agreement for 3 exhibitions, that have all been clearly identified. The first of which is the Camera of Arezzo. For those of you who went to your website, go visit this website too. I would encourage you to do so. Claire was the principal curator for this exhibition with Florence. It's the first of our projects with Florence, and we're extremely pleased and grateful that they have entrusted to us this object, which is inventory number 1 from the Archaeological Museum's collection, and certainly one of the most important works of Etruscan art to have survived from antiquity. So we have language that is very detailed about 3 specific exhibitions, and the last phrase is, at the end of these 3 projects, we can decide if we want to move forward with other things or not. Maybe they'll be sick of us by then, I don't know. So we have the pleasure and the opportunity to bring to the Getty Villa works of art from this incredibly important collection of Etruscan and other ancient works of art. And on the flip side, Florence has the opportunity to take advantage of our conservation laboratories if they want to. If they'd like us to treat material, we're happy to do that. And we have also worked with them to elevate their profile within the city of Florence. Because anyone who's ever gone to Florence usually doesn't visit the Archaeological Museum unless they're in the field. They're going to the Uffizi, they're going to the Pitti, they're going to all of the Renaissance treasures of Florence. To see the David. They'll walk by it on their way to the Accademia, but they won't go in. And so they are, Italian museums are actually starting to look to America for models for development and for profile raising and for fundraising. And so the museum in Florence, the Archaeological Museum, has created a friends group, the Amici della Camera, to help raise funds for the renovation of their building. And so we are, although we are not fundraising for the museum, because this would be in violation of our trust and our not-for-profit status, we help them by bringing works of art to their museum, to our museum, and raising awareness of the museum in America. We are currently trying to undertake a similar arrangement with Sicily, which is an autonomous region in Italy, and so they undertake their own agreements, and hopefully we will begin developing a series of projects with various museums and sites in Sicily to bring works of art from Sicily back to the Getty Villa as well. So, yes.
Will either of you be attending the CPAC meetings?
No. No. Yeah, no. Do all of you know what that question refers to?
The CPAC
No, yes.
I'm sure that, the CPAC is the Cultural Property Advisory Committee, and when the UNESCO 1970 Convention was implemented in US law, and as I mentioned before, one of the provisions was to say we encourage signatories to UNESCO to work collaboratively together and develop ways in which to combat looting together. And one of the, at least in US law, one of the collaborative ways this is done is through treaties or memoranda of understanding, which they'd already alluded to, between us and another country that says, we'd like to enter into a memorandum of understanding with you to protect a certain class of object or whatever it is that's in danger of being destroyed or looted. And these requests go to the State Department. They basically go to the Cultural Property Advisory Committee, which is set up by this same implementation legislation in the US law. And the Cultural Property Advisory Committee listens to these requests, weighs them, comments on it, etc., often has a public hearing on these various requests, and then makes a recommendation about whether to accept the request or to send it back for more work or deny it outright, etc. And there is a hearing on, when is it? It's
The 12th or the 13th?
This is
Coming up.
on
In the next few days.
Yes, in Washington, D.C. Basically, it's a hearing, it's an interim hearing on the U.S.-Italy Memorandum of Understanding, so the one that's being referred to as well as a new Memorandum of Understanding request that's been made by El Salvador.
Does CPAC then only listen to cases or situations post-1970? Would they listen to?
They don't arbitrate individual disputes. Or particular disputes over cultural property. They listen to whether they're going to recommend that the U.S. enter into a treaty arrangement with another country, and another country just petitions.
I see.
Yeah, and that petitioning process is what's been facilitated by the UNESCO Convention, basically.
So in preparation for CPAC, you are allowed to submit written statement. You can request to attend the hearing, either as an observer or as a speaker. We submitted a letter because there wasn't actually anybody who could go to Washington, nor did we really feel it was necessary to go. We hadn't been asked by anyone to go, but we felt that since they were addressing the Italy-US MOU, that it would be appropriate in our new situation and in the manner in which we're moving forward to address our agreement and the positive results of our agreement. So I wanted to sort of pose the question, why do you need an agreement? Well, and answer it myself. Because I think it's important to reinforce a point that was made earlier in that this was not an open public forum in a court of law that underscored the need for the agreement. It was actually a means to avoid an open public forum in a court of law. And so the agreements that the Met has formulated and that the Getty formulated were legal and binding documents, and that they sort of very clearly laid out the request from the Italian government for the return of objects, the agreement to return those objects, which is sort of the front matter of the agreement, and then the whole second half is about moving forward and the kinds of cultural collaborations that we as a museum can undertake with our counterparts in Italy. And I think that they serve a very strong role in today's cultural climate, because with this memorandum of cultural agreement, we have a clear understanding going into discussions with our colleagues in Italy about various projects that they are willing to work with us. It's not a cold request out of the blue for an object coming on loan for an exhibition, for example. We sort of have the stage set for us to have a friendlier conversation from the very beginning, and that can be really important in some of these discussions, because many museums have very ambitious plans for exhibitions, and of course the Italians are used to the same 50 objects being asked for over and over and over and over and over and over again, and they quite often say no for very good reasons, due to fragility, overexposure, it's attached to a building, you name it. And we would never ask for something like that, I hasten to say. But with this kind of platform on which to work, we sort of have a firmer footing going in the door, I think, to start these discussions. And at the Getty, it's very much a dialogue. We really want to make these projects a collaboration. We don't want to walk in the door and sort of dictate the terms of an exhibition or a project or a loan. We want to find out what they need and what they want, and ideally, we will encounter many situations in which there are stupendous works of art in museum basements that have, for whatever reason, not been able to be treated or cleaned or brought up to the public galleries, and we can step in and say, hey, we can take care of that for you, and if you leave it with us for 6 months to 2 years, then it goes right into your galleries when it returns to Italy. And so in fact, we have a bronze statue from Naples, from the Naples Archaeological Museum in our conservation lab right now, who was extremely unstable. He had very weak ankles. He couldn't be put on public display because if there was a major earthquake, he definitely would have gone right over. So he was sort of languishing in storage because they have so much other material to work with. And they suggested that project to us. I did not go to Naples and say, how about that? So I'm extremely pleased and happy with the collaboration as it's gone thus far, and in the kinds of material that we've had the opportunity to bring to the villa. You know, the Chimera, the Apollo that's in the conservation lab, and then there's another bronze statue on loan from Naples that went right into one of our galleries. They didn't have room in their galleries. They said, "Here, this will look perfect right there," and it does. Yeah, look, he's on the website too.
The agreement, I think, allowed us to get away from this ownership, this sort of heavy emphasis on property that is at the core of why you're here, the class that you're studying, and to move it over into stewardship. Now, sometimes that sounds like a very superficial difference. It's not meant to just be a sort of feel-good difference, but it really is more about a sort of joint responsibility for caring and dealing with cultural objects. And so it was an important way to escape this sort of polarity, this face-off that I think you've probably been studying, in which the law, you know, intended to address certain very fundamental rights and issues that we hold dear, you know, economic rights and property and individual freedoms, but it doesn't, in this field of cultural heritage, these rights don't mesh on to the kind of cultural rights that we're trying to deal with. They don't mesh over very neatly the bundle of, you know, community rights, you know, and feelings about heritage. There's just not a good connection there, and that's why you're studying these cases. That's why these cases have come up. So to get around that, you know, face-off, and to get over to the stewardship side and figure out what can we do together, because we have big problems throughout the world of conservation. That's it. So there's a lot that is needed on that side. So this is why it's good. Of course, you want to follow the law, but you can't let it also impede something that, you know, the kind of bigger picture of values that cultural objects hold.
In light of the positive results you've had with Italy and these items, do other museums or collections have approached the Getty who might be in the midst of a dispute over property to kind of see how it was tackled and how they might move forward in similar manner?
Well, on the directorial level, yes, they all talk to each other. You know, they're all, many of the museums that have faced the same situation or might be facing the same situation are frequently members of AAMD, and a lot of the discussions just simply take place within that environment at those annual meetings to compare notes. The legal counsels for the museums, in our case, the Trust Legal Counsel, all talk to each other and compare notes. So yeah, there's a bit of back and forth in that regard. Yeah.
Since you were here by grace of the Institute of Museum Ethics, I was wondering, is there an ethics committee at the Getty that reviews not just the policies but also the practices, and how long has it been there?
Not to my knowledge.
Well,
Well, we have
ethics
ethical
point.
policies, yes. Oh yeah, we do have ethics.
Yeah.
point, yeah.
I mean, as
Yes.
a practicing institution of, you know, a body of people who work in this field, and in many different capacities, you know, we do have a system for posing ethical questions or raising ethical flags in which they can be addressed by the institution. I haven't tried it yet. But it does.
Is that an internal system?
It
like
is.
Internal to the different departments?
It's internal
To the Getty, to the Getty as a whole.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's not program
Yeah.
dictated.
Right.
We also have a very clear business policy and a conflict of interest policy. So, we're filling out forms all the time, and if there are any questions that are raised, we get a phone call from one of our legal counsels to ask us to clarify, and we do, and they're on to the next point. Ideally, you haven't done anything wrong. Violating policy is easy to do sometimes unknowingly, but I wanted to. What?
May I just jump in? I wanted to
Yeah.
just respond with something actually that both of you said, and Claire, you talked about again this sort of move towards stewardship, a different way of viewing, again, relationships to things, relationships to cultural heritage, and away from a property kind of concept a little bit. And one of the things that I think, one of the things that's a danger raised by the move towards stewardship, is that it ends up being a slogan, right? Or that there's a potential for it to be, we're doing it, and in a sense, a recasting of the Universal Museum. And I'm not saying this is what you're doing. I'm just saying there is a danger of it being recasting of the Universal Museum in sort of like, warmer and fuzzier terms of saying, because inevitably the thing that needs to be stewarded is stewarded by someone for some purpose, et cetera, et cetera. So, and part of the justification, at least for collecting, that had been, underscoring of the the universalist internationalist position, was often cast as, we're preserving it for all of humankind, and we can do a good, do a better job at it, and blah blah blah. So there's that. However, in hearing about how these agreements and some of the agreements that you're talking about have been raised, I think it's more meaningful. I mean, it's clearly there's something more substantive there about what it means to steward heritage. And one of the things I've sort of learned from this, and very interestingly, is the ways in which your agreement differs from the Mets, and then saying, and it reminds me a little bit of when we've talked about NAGPRA, and we've talked about some of those agreements that have come up about where is the impetus coming from, where are the research questions coming from, or where are the decisions coming from, who's an active participant in the dialogue. And when you say, we don't necessarily say, these are the 6 objects, we'd like one of those, but in fact you allow for the discussion, in fact, in some sort of organic sense, to facilitate other museums, the source countries, to say, we are, this is an object that we'd be interested in having conserved, or having on display in an international context, or doing something with in some way. So the motivation for what's being focused on is part of that power, in a sense, to decide what heritage is going to be representing, is, in a sense, given to Italy, in this case, to decide what is the heritage that they want to be presenting to the world. And obviously you may say, well, okay, maybe not. How about that one? Instead. But in a sense, there's a yeah, I'm sure. I mean, but there's a bit of a dialogue where some of the power and the decision making with regard to what is going to be the stewarded heritage, right, is actually the power is in Italy's hands to propose and to begin the dialogue just as much as from your end. So it ends up being much more of a two-way street, because I think that's one of the interesting things about NAGPRA, et cetera, is the fact that Native American groups can instigate the dialogue, can instigate the process also, and that shifts the power dynamics. It shifts where the narratives are coming from, what is regarded as cultural heritage, and I think that's a particularly interesting sort of shift of the terms of discussion. that's coming out of your agreement.
Yeah, well, it's not just a sort of passive, in the past, maybe it was a more passive stewardship, you know, we're the most able, so therefore we have the right. And I think it's shifted way beyond that, and to be a very an active stewardship that generates knowledge, generates access to knowledge, because that's what, it's really maybe not that very object now, but it's the potential and possibility of having access to it in the 21st century, which, you know, then opens up a whole other approaches to making these things available, or internet, or
Yeah.
Or even smaller.
Have these experiences and opportunities influenced your educational programs and the way that visitors experience the museum?
Yes. But I would say, not so much with the permanent collection, but certainly with the exhibitions program. I mean, one of the few ways that we can reinforce our beliefs about the importance of archaeology and site preservation and object preservation is through special exhibitions that can bring that into part of the message when you're presenting archaeological material. So, for example, one of our most recent exhibitions actually started here in New York at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World on the site of Bonny, which is in the Republic of Georgia. This is material that had never been to the United States before, and it was brought to the Sackler, it was brought to ISAW, and then it started this sort of international tour, and we were the last venue for the tour. And we knew that when the material had been presented at ISAW, it had within this single exhibition here, 2 fabulous bronze lamps that didn't go to any of the other venues. And that, of course, piqued our interest. Well, how come those aren't going anywhere else? And they're so fabulous, why aren't they going anywhere else? And it turned out that they were part of a specific hoard of material that had been found at the site that was being studied, and that still much of it remained untreated. So when we had the opportunity to bring the exhibition to the villa, we incorporated into the exhibition agreement the proposal to treat 2 more of the lamps that were part of this hoard. And so the lamps came from Georgia in advance of the exhibition, and we did the treatment and the study and the materials analysis. It became part of the exhibition presentation, talking about archaeological material and how it is treated within the laboratory environment. And in fact, one of the reasons that we're here now is to go back to ISAW tomorrow to start the discussion about the publication of that material and what the Getty will contribute to that publication in terms of conservation and scientific information. So through our exhibitions, we can reinforce the archaeological message. This is not a message that we can reinforce with our permanent collection very much at all, because much of it comes from unknown sources. So we have to do other teaching with the collection, iconographic, mythological, you know, that kind of an approach. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Can you teach about the changing acquisition policies and the changing history of acquisitions, including therefore using the fact of unknown sources to be part of the teaching?
We have not been inclined to do so, I would say. I mean, we could, sure, but it would, and it was proposed to us that we go around and label everything thusly so that people could take a looted tour of the collection kind of experience, which, you know, we declined to do. I mean, we have a
I'm
very...
sure Oscar Mascarella will offer to do that looted tour for you.
I'm sure he will. But, you know, it's our purpose to undertake the study of the ancient world, not the study of modern acquisition policies. So unlike Nostoi or some of these exhibitions that have been put up in Italy celebrating the return of material and talking about the process, that's not what we do. That's not what we're about. Yeah.
You know, it was the expectation that once Italy started this, that all of these other countries would start to do the same thing, but I don't think that really has happened to the extent that people thought, right? Like Greece, Turkey, Tunisia, I mean, you name it, every country around the Mediterranean could kind of start the same initiative.
They could, yeah.
Well, hasn't the rumor is that Greece has hired all of the folks involved, has hired like the Italians to help them out figuring out how they did it. I think that's,
But
Well,
it
the
hasn't really
Italians-
quite happened yet, right?
Well, the Italians and the Greeks have been cooperating for years, because I think, in fact, that was the intent, is that, following the Italian model, that other source countries would do that. But you're right, it hasn't really materialized. There have been some inquiries sent, but there has been no follow-up. So I don't know what's behind it, but it just hasn't really happened. And I'm not sure why. But I wanted to bring up a couple of points for consideration, not things that I haven't answered for, but things that are still out there sort of as unresolved issues for museums, and two in particular, one related to acquisitions and the other related to exhibitions, in fact. And the one related to acquisitions is the donation of works of art to collections that now have very stringent acquisition policies. The Getty has always been in the fortunate position of having no development department, no need to fundraise, no need to really cultivate collectors very much and solicit works of art into the collection in that way, in the manner that almost every other museum does. Given the economic climate, that tide is turning and we're all suddenly becoming development people. But so as a result, donations to our collection have really been in areas that are not complicated. I think our largest area of donation to the museum has been photographs, in fact. It's a very lively market, it's a very affordable market, and you can purchase fabulous photographs for $5,000 or something like that. And donations to the antiquities collection have always been extremely complicated because of our restricted acquisition policy. And I give you an example. We had a private collection of ancient glass in Los Angeles that the owners very much wanted to go to a public museum so that they could be put on display, used as a teaching tool and things like that. But and although they'd kept sales receipts and everything, they could not meet a 1970 UNESCO date for any of the pieces in their collection. And ancient glass, unlike some archaeological artifacts, is found across the Mediterranean. It's everywhere. And it's extremely difficult to pinpoint one locale for any given type of ancient glass. So there were lots of arguments back and forth. Should we suddenly start identifying categories of objects that didn't need to abide by a 1970 date because you'd never be able to determine where they came from? And the answer was no, we don't want to do that. Instead, we had to turn down to the donation, much to the owner's frustration, and mine too, because I'd spent months researching the collection in anticipation of being able to accept it. It's now in Santa Barbara. Santa Barbara Museum of Art accepted it as a donation. But for some museums, this is a very tricky thing to try and address. Those that are cultivating donors that have works of art that they would like to come to their collection someday, but lack the provenance that their acquisitions policy dictates. So that's one outstanding issue. And the other is about loans both to and from our collection. Because if we tried to apply the UNESCO date of 1970 to our own collection, almost none of the pieces would pass muster. It's a young collection. It was formed in the late 70s, 80s, and 90s off the art market. And we have received criticism for not establishing a loan policy, loans of works of art to our collection. And we have really resisted and hesitated about doing so because we know that if we did, that our own works couldn't pass that criteria. So when we include works from our collection into exhibitions to which the British Museum is lending, we enter into this very delicate little dance about this letter that's required according to their policies. To the best of our knowledge, it wasn't, but we can't prove that. So what do we do? So this is still very much a gray area, and I think probably one of the reasons that most museums have not adopted specific loan policies. part of it has to do with that, part of it has to do, I think, with taking works from private collections and how to incorporate those works of art that have no context within the exhibition context. There's all kinds of challenges in that. So those are sort of, and then the third is, of course, the market. But we talked about the proving provenance issues with the market already, and how the tide has turned and the onus is on the seller rather than the buyer to provide provenance. So that's still a developing picture as we move forward in time.
One of the positive aspects, which we couldn't have imagined 5 years ago probably, was that the questions that Karol just brought up. There'll be a meeting quite soon between the archaeologists, the Archaeological Institute of America, which has been a kind of protagonist in all of these issues, and with the AAMD, the Association of Art Museum Directors. And 5 years ago, I don't think we would have all been in the same room. There was a huge amount of antagonism, and people were really, polarized, seriously polarized. But they are planning a joint task force now to really look hard at these kinds of questions, so there isn't that so much of a rigid black and white on either side. But we have to address certain outstanding issues. There are thousands of objects that are kind of caught in a limbo now. What will happen to them? Something that needs to be done. But wouldn't you agree that it's a pretty watershed moment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in my class, you'll remember you read the amicus briefs in Steinhardt, which pitted the AIA and others against the AAM and AAMD and others, right? I mean, we read that, so, and they were as polar. That was really the moment.
Good one
Great
to
polarized, right? Exactly. And so it's very interesting to see these groups come to the table to talk.
Yeah.
One other thing I actually wanted to ask you all a question, because I think one of the issues or not an issue, but one of the current situations that remains fluctuating as well is the public perception about all of this. So I was curious, besides what you were assigned to read by your instructor, where most of you were getting your information about these issues. Was it in the national and international press? Show of hands. Nobody read the New York Times?
Do you mean the Getty issue specifically?
Any American Museum Italy issue, not specifically the Getty. I just mean in general. If you were, I'm just curious to know where you were reading about it. If it was in the newspapers, if it was in blogs. Yeah. Because there's, those are, although the newspaper might be considered perhaps less opinionated than a blogger, they're both opinionated sources, if you will. And I brought something to share with Alex, which was it's the newest edition of a magazine called Primo, which is for and about Italian Americans. So this is for people of Italian cultural heritage. And we were interviewed for this issue to talk about who owns Italian culture. And it was very clear from the outset of this interview that the opinion of the interviewer, Mr. Rosario, was that Italian culture should be shared with the world, versus what he perceived to be the view that he perceived the Italians' opinion to be that all Italian culture should be returned to Italy. So using our situation as an example, they came out with this article, and it was an interesting process to go through to try and answer his questions objectively, and to try and not be cast to be of the same opinion as he was during the course of this interview. We did a lot of corrections to the text before it was submitted, but there are certainly arenas out there that have very strong opinions about this, and I don't know that consensus will ever be reached.
I was about to say, the ethical lesson is that you'll never win. Right? Exactly.
You'll never win, but we hope we're gaining ground.
Yeah. Well, I thank you. Are there any other questions before we retire? I think, thank you guys very much.